Hello and welcome to the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. My name is Claudia Rizzini. I'm the Executive Director of the Fellowship Program. The Radcliffe Institute brings together students, scholars and practitioners from across disciplines and professions to create and share transformative ideas. You can participate in this laboratory of ideas by attending public programs such as this one, visiting virtual exhibitions, or pursuing the special collections held at the Schomburg Library. To learn more about Radcliffe, please feel free to sign up to receive information on news and events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. We'll begin the program with a presentation by Professor Robert Reid-Pharr. After the presentation, the speaker will respond to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time throughout the program. We ask that you keep your questions brief to allow to address as many as possible in the time that we have together. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce this year Carl and Lily Pforzheimer Foundation Fellow, Robert Reid-Pharr. He is Professor of Studies of Women, Gender and Sexuality, and Professor of African American and African American Studies at Harvard University. Professor Reid-Pharr is a prolific writer on American and African American literature. His first book, Conjugal Union, The Body, the House, and the Black American, analyzes the role that class plays in the constructions of Black racial identity, shedding new lights on how scholars understood the emergence of the African American novel in the 19th century. Robert is a leading theorist of gender and queer studies. His second book, Black Gay Man Essays, redefines our notion of what it means to be Black, gay, and male, as well as what it means to be a contemporary intellectual. Once You Go Black, Choice, Desire, and the Black American Intellectual is Reid-Pharr's third book. With this work, he pays homage to Black thinkers of the 20th century, while at the same time building the case for their responsibility in defining the identity of contemporary Black intellectuals. Reid-Pharr opened the way to new scholarly studies in the Black Atlantic internationalism. His latest book, Archives of Flesh, Spain, African America, and Posthumanist Critique, explores the deep history of intellectual exchange between African American writers with Spain, Portugal, and the Hispanophone and Lusophone world. At Radcliffe, Robert is writing James Baldwin, The Making of an American Icon. This project is biographical to the extent that it follows Baldwin's life calendar. However, unlike other biographies, it seeks neither to rescue Baldwin's reputation, nor to set the record straight. It focuses instead on the unlikeliness of Baldwin's rise to national prominence. Robert will ask how an individual who stood so solidly outside the mainstream of American social and cultural life could become one of the most prominent intellectuals of his time. And even more surprisingly, how is that the continued adoration of James Baldwin has been so intimately mixed with such shocking expression of scorn and abuse. Robert has lectured extensively, not only in the United States, but internationally. He held visiting professorship at University of Chicago, the University of Oregon, Oxford University, the American University of Beirut, and the College of William and Mary. He was the recipient of several fellowships and grants. Among them, the Humboldt Fellowship, the 2016 Guggenheim Fellowship, and grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And now it is my pleasure to give the floor to Robert Reid-Pharr.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Before I begin, I would like to just take an opportunity to thank the small army of people at Radcliffe, at the Radcliffe Institute, who are working so hard to make this year's fellowship program both broadly useful and quite fun for all of this year's fellows, even though we don't have the privilege of being in each other's presence. To the fellows themselves, I'd like to say publicly how impressed I am by each of you and how deeply honored I am to be among your number. Your work is not only clever, but also vitally concerned with the needs of not only the United States, but the whole of our planet. I thank you for that. And finally, I'd like to begin every public presentation that I give by acknowledging the fact that anyone who shows up to hear me bumble through a talk or who reads something that I've written honors me deeply. Thus, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of today's audience and those people who will see this event in its recorded version for your presence. Your attendance is a gift to me, and I'd like to acknowledge that fact with my gratitude and my humility. I won't be giving you today an overview of my project. Instead, I'll be reading two sections from a rough draft of a chapter that I've completed during my time as a Radcliffe Fellow. I hope that you will like, and I hope that you will understand it. For now, you only need to know that I'm deeply concerned with the way that celebrity works in American culture, and that what I treat in this chapter is James Baldwin's relationship with the modernist painter Buford Delaney, who is often thought of as Baldwin's mentor, but whose life Baldwin did not in many particulars emulate. Now, the chapter is entitled Funhouse. There are houses broadly known and often visited that nonetheless can be barely discerned, if at all, on official maps. The routes to them are always too dangerous, too narrow, too soiled, too brashly lit, too full of gloom. Their entrances are haphazardly announced and their addresses infrequently remembered, yet their few inhabitants and many patrons never seem to miss their marks. And when their doors are opened, when one crosses the red portal and enters rooms full of mirrors, rooms choked with sound and smoke, rooms ripe with dissolving human scent, one must learn to see again, must tame unfaithful eyes, must submit to the inelegant touch of dark color and animal wanting, must relinquish hold on cherished conceptions of the self, must become a tarnished, broken, available thing, and learn to like it. At 16, James Baldwin could find no exit. Nearing the end of both his formal education and his time as a minister, he suffered through bare-knuckled racism, choking poverty, and his stepfather's uncontainable madness. There were no vehicles within his reach that might deliver him to a life of either artistic success or even relative social and financial security. The boy had reached a moment of crisis, fantastic crisis. On the cusp of adulthood, he would be forced not only to make a series of life-changing decisions and to make them quickly, but also to be upfront about it. Thus, ever practical, clever, and blunt, James took a risky and outsized bet. Like many before him, he sensed that his only option was to test the precarious and forbidden paths that began just outside his family's cramped apartment, but that offered no certainty or promise of pleasant endings. It was his friend Emile Capuya who suggested a way out. Emile was far more daring and intrepid than his talented classmate, and he had already begun his riotous explorations of New York. By 1940, the gifted young writer who, like Baldwin, worked on the Magpie at DeWitt Clinton High School was dating a dancer, Jessie, who was several years his senior. For her part, Jessie made extra money by modeling at the Art Students League on West 57th Street in Manhattan. There, she was painted by an exquisitely gifted 39-year-old African-American artist with solidly staid and old-fashioned first and last names, Buford Delaney. This fact alone was remarkable, as an unspoken, if heretofore strictly followed, rule of the Art Students League was that Black men should make themselves scarce when nude white women modeled. Jessie was insistent, however, and Delaney not only painted her image, but also befriended both the young dancer and her new beau. Upon meeting this oddities of oddities, a working Black artist, Emile immediately understood that Delaney, who like Baldwin was the child of a minister and perhaps homosexual to boot, had a great deal to offer his troubled friend. So he made his introductions and arrangements, then left James to find his way downtown, shuffling along unfamiliar and menacing streets, finally arriving at the door to Buford's building at 181 Green Street, where he found himself confronted by a short, round, brown man who, when he had completed his instant X-ray of the teenage boy's brain, lungs, liver, heart, bowels, and spinal column, invited him in for tea. Buford Delaney's Green Street loft was foul. In a June 2010 remembrance, the jazz critic Richard Hadlock recalled subletting space from Delaney, who had been renting 2 floors above a warehouse for $30 a month. Both floors had a toilet and a coal tap, but no heating. Hadlock and his friend, the musician and musicologist Tony Haggart, moved into the second floor flat, which had not been cleaned or occupied for more than a decade. So they spent their first days cutting through the soot, the crud, the grime, in order to make the place livable. The arrangement worked nicely for a while, as the two paid the rent for both floors, allowing Buford a brief respite from his always desperate struggle to earn enough money to live and work. Still, the loft remained woefully inadequate. Even as Delaney had already achieved considerable recognition as an artist, he would never raise himself above the hand-to-mouth existence that his occasional teaching, erratic sales of painting, and even more erratic receipt of grants afforded. The novelist and visual artist Henry Miller, who began a decades-long friendship with Delaney while he lived on Green Street, would later remember Buford's home as foreboding and insalubrious. Arriving one winter's night in the company of a mutual friend to spring a surprise visit, Miller was provoked to fits of exasperation by the state of the building and the burning truths that that state plainly told. I shall never forget the forlorn, dismal look of Green Street as we stood across the way looking up at Buford's windows to see if he was home. There are streets which seem commemorated to the pangs and frustrations of the artist, having nothing to do with art, shunned by all living as soon as the work of day is done. They are infested with the sinister shadows of crime and with prowling alley cats, which thrive on the garbage and odor that littered the gutters and pavement. Once inside, things seemed to turn from bad to grisly. It was the cold that shocked Miller. Only a roaring furnace kept at a constant temperature of 120 centigrade can combat the chill of the grave, which emanates from the dripping walls, floors, and ceilings, Miller wrote. And of course, there will never be such a furnace at 181 Green Street. One must wonder what possibly could have possessed James Baldwin, skinny, scared, and 16, to totter through the unattractive front door of such a cold and uninviting place. Even more to the point, what can we make of a precocious adolescence visiting the home of an unknown man, 23 years his senior, a man to whom he was introduced by teenagers who knew nothing more about him, that he was talented, interesting, and fun? How, moreover, can we square the reality of Delaney's squalid living conditions, only a half step away from homelessness, with the fact of his relative professional success? Buford had had 2 one-man shows in 1938, the first at the 8th Street Playhouse in New York, the second at Gallery C in Washington, D.C. That same year, his pleasant image was featured in the October 3rd edition of Life magazine as part of a 12-page, lavishly illustrated spread on African American society and culture entitled Negroes. The U.S. also has a minority problem. Buford Delaney, one of the most talented Negro painters, combines a direct approach with a skillful hand, read the caption below a handsome photograph of Buford sitting outside at the annual Washington Square show in New York. Behind him hung 6 gorgeous paintings, 5 portraits, and a seascape. He approvingly examines a 7th that he holds in his hands as he sits, legs crossed at the ankles, a crumpled fedora resting precariously on one knee, and a fresh white smock accentuating his warmly lit face. Buford was one of only 3 artists featured in the 2-page section of the larger article. To the left of the painter's attractive image stand photographs of a building and 2 interiors designed by the architect Paul Williams. To his right, a full-page image of Augusta Savage at work on a still unfired statue. Sculptress Savage puts finishing touches on a decidedly Negroid faun, Life politely informs us. All of this suggests that Delaney lived the life of a gifted artist, a gifted Black intellectual, occasionally harassed, yes, but also accepted and perhaps even feted by the more cultured and well-informed members of the white elite. Yet when he was first visited by Henry Miller, the cold Inside, the loft was so crushing that they sat in their overcoats, collars turned up, hats pulled down over our ears, our hands stuffed deep in our pockets, only to escape into the streets where the cold was just as brutal, but not so tightly focused. This is not to say, however, that the bleak and dreary visage of 181 Green Street absolutely shut down the possibility of pleasure, adventure, camaraderie, and social, if not physical, warmth. The space was often described as remarkable, indeed magical. The single drab room dominated by Delaney's kindness and sophistication was the site of grand learning, exploration, and adventure for those lucky enough to enter it. Buford, the ever-diligent artist and craftsman, had filled the loft with his many remarkable works. At the same time, following the example of photographer and curator Alfred Stieglitz, who dressed his famed gallery in American Place in pristine white, Buford most often covered his walls with paper, his paintings and furniture with sheets, so as not only to achieve order and simplicity, but also to capture and contain as much light as possible as he managed the complexities of color and form that were his hallmarks. His iconic 1946 work, Campfire in the Park, now held by the Smithsonian American Art Museum, showcases the artist's remarkable attention to color, light, and composition, while poignantly demonstrating the ways in which Buford's two passions, portraiture and abstraction, pulled with and against one another. The painting is precisely structured. Though the six figures warming themselves by the campfire dominate the center of the work, it is Delaney's ability to condense everyday, unseen objects to their elemental forms that makes it so daring. The fire hydrant at the bottom left is reduced to basics, creating it as geometric abstraction come fetish. Sitting directly across from it at right, the black bordered manhole is a study in simplicity and artlessness, even as the rage of red, blue, yellow, white, and orange escaping it reiterates Delaney's fascination with the complicated of reflections of light and color that dominate our environments, but that we most often barely notice. The lamppost / direction sign that references but does not touch the six human figures to its left repeats the effect. Composed of straight black lines pointing aggressively up and right, while the light, the single bulb, faces elsewhere, the figure names both geometric certainty and aesthetic rowdiness. Finally, the park itself is depicted as a wild thing, shape and color barely behaving themselves. The only sureness truth, one might naively say, is the blue central square, a hesitant and unreliable stage that eventually dissipates, while the rest of the park succumbs to a riotous compositional object, pigment, and form combining themselves outside the scope of human conceit. But where, one might ask, are the faces? Why, in a painting that is so well lit that the light seems to escape the canvas, such that the heat of the campfire threatens to burn through from one dimension to the next, are there no telltale markers of human subjectivity and individuality? The painting is at once fun and discomforting. It blurs the line between community and dereliction, beauty and disaster. My guess is that the six figures at the work's center are men, Black men, homeless men, men who were never redeemed from the insult of the Great Depression, men without borders or facades, impossible men, men who could not and cannot exist. But I'm in no way certain. What I do know, however, is that what made Delaney so audacious, enterprising, and dangerous was that he dared name and represent a basic and profoundly disturbing reality of American aesthetics and communality. We're particularly adept at staunchly turning toward the immensity of ugliness, poverty, white supremacy, woman-hating, and intellectualism that structure our society in order to frame and flatten them, producing sometimes remarkably inventive and aesthetically stirring images in the process. I must rush to repeat, however, that part of the reason that Delaney's increasing focus on abstraction and subsequent dissolution of the human form in his work is so surprising is the fact that he was also a grand portraitist, one who was a primary chronicler of mid-20th century African-American celebrity painting, and celebrity, painting or sketching the likenesses of Marian Anderson, W.C. Handy, Ethel Waters, Ella Fitzgerald, W.E.B. Du Bois, and of course, James Baldwin. One of Delaney's finest works is his 1942 portrait of the boxer turned actor, Canada Lee. In 1934, after having wound down a successful career as a welterweight fighter, Lee landed a supporting role in the play Brother Mose, written by Augustus Smith and supported by the Depression-era Civil Works Administration. This was followed by part in the theater union's revival of Stevedore. His true break came, however, in 1936 when he landed the part of Banquo in the Federal Theater Project's production of Voodoo Macbeth, directed by Orson Welles and staged at Harlem's Lafayette Theater, where 12-year-old James Baldwin saw the work in the company of his friend and mentor, Orilla Miller. What one can say with the greatest of clarity and ease then is that each time Canada Lee was imaged, each quote, photograph, film clip, or portrait was a joyful announcement of the arrival of an impossibly potent and glittering example of Black success. Sport, theater, film, radio, and art all open themselves to the charms of this handsome, muscled, athletic, spirited, and intelligent Black man. The genius of Delaney's image is that he captures all this, all that wanting, waiting, needing, and exuberant revelation with impressive confidence and simplicity. The work is serene, buoyant, and effortless. We can again clearly see Delaney's interest in compositional precision, the fastidious color blocking, yellow, brown, gray, blue, the careful centering of Lee's torso, the V of a broad chest giving way to a narrow waist, the fussy attention to the creases of Lee's shirt and pants, his sympathetically sketched face looking off stage, reminding us of the grand scope of his vision, and finally his hands falling nonchalantly between spread legs, suggesting a man, a Black man no less, with nothing either to hide or regret. What truly holds the portrait, however, what turns the work from being simply good to something at once extravagant, eccentric, whimsical, and fantastic, is the suspiciously placed arc of color between Lee's legs. Buford is winking at us here. Lee seems to be sitting on a rainbow, touching and caressing it, in fact. He has reached the sweet spot in American culture, that electric fount of erotic energy that undergirds all celebrity, the tail of the dragon that occasionally lifts one to the heavens, even as it always threatens a sudden retreat, leaving stars to fall with a dull thump to the unyielding earth. The arc of color nestled comfortably between Lee's thighs is, in fact, the same uncontrolled shock of color and light and form that we saw so ably demonstrated in Campfire in the Park. In this instance, however, the wildness and convolution of pigment and figuration that Delaney was always at pains to represent in Marshall was, at least for a moment, quiet and calm. It in no way surprises me that young James Baldwin became one of Delaney's acolytes, nor am I at all startled or shocked that the two would maintain an intimate and complex friendship until Buford's March 26, 1979 death at Paris's St. Anne's Hospital for the Insane, Le Centre Hospitalier Saint-Anne. Not only was Buford the first fully committed secular Black visual artist with whom Baldwin had come into contact, but also in a sense the first person to offer him expert instruction in the intricacies of Black celebrity. Buford was the first walking living proof for me that a Black man could be an artist. In a warmer time, a less blasphemous place, he would have been recognized as my master and I his pupil. He became, for me, an example of courage and integrity, humility and passion, and absolute integrity. I saw him shaken many times, and I lived to see him broken, but I never saw him bow. It is this matter of mastery and apprenticeship that takes hold of one's attention. There is an ever-increasing number of critics and historians who are fascinated by the relationship between the gifted painter and his adolescent protege, all of whom seem deeply enamored of Baldwin's claims that it was, in fact, Delaney, who taught him how to see, taught him in the way that only a sophisticated visual artist could. Baldwin repeated many times the story of standing on a Greenwich Village corner with his mentor and being instructed to look down at a puddle at their feet. I looked, and all I saw was water, he said. Instructed to look again, Baldwin was then able to put all Buford's training to proper use. This time, instead of simply a puddle of water, blank, inert, and two-dimensional, the young writer glimpsed for the first moment the visual complexity that so animated his mentor. I saw oil on the water and the city reflected in the puddle. It was a great revelation to me. I can't explain it. He taught me how to see and how to trust what I saw. I doubt there could be a more subtle and lovely recitation of either the complex relationship between students and teachers, or the even more complex process of artists coming to self-awareness, the recognition of the multidimensional density of the worlds that they are attempting to represent. I suspect, though, that the prettiness of this scene, the way in which it provokes one to imagine a quick change of focus, a fast embrace of a complicated aesthetic, works to shut us off from fully understanding what made this intimate moment between Buford and James so affecting. This description of a crucial episode in Baldwin's development was related in a long interview with Jordan L. Grubley in the spring 1984 issue of the Paris Review. As I've said already, however, Baldwin was particularly fond of this story and repeated it often. It is, in fact, the centerpiece of his 1965 transition essay, magazine essay on the painter for Buford Delaney. He was then and is now working all the time, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that he is seeing all the time. And the reality of his seeing caused me to begin to see. Now what I began to see was not at that time, to tell the truth, his painting. That came later. What I saw, first of all, was a brown leaf on black asphalt, oil moving like water in the like mercury in the black water of the gutter, grass pushing itself up through the sidewalk. I want to point out, however, that he begins that quote by saying, many years ago, in poverty and uncertainty, Buford and I would walk together through the streets of New York. Indeed, while this version of Baldwin's dazzling story of recognition and revelation was just as beautiful as the others, it was considerably more candid. James and Buford were compelled into the streets filled, still fresh with rain, by not only their camaraderie and deep appreciation for each other's increasing talent, but also by frank poverty and fearsome uncertainty. In Harlem, the Baldwin family was deeply menaced by their patriarch David Baldwin's ever more quickly paced descent into madness, a fact that forced their family to commit him to a mental hospital where he died on July 28, 1943, at just the time that James and Buford were making their mind-expanding promenades. Meanwhile, according to Delaney's biographer, David Leeming, the talented artist was already struggling with the fear and anxiety, the voices, he called them, that would eventually prove to be his undoing. As a teenager, Buford had witnessed firsthand the infamous 1919 race riot that took place in his hometown of Knoxville, where friends and family scattered for their lives, hearing that white gunmen with high-powered automatic weapons were shooting African Americans from the rooftops. In 1929, he arrived in liberal progressive New York just in time for the start of the Great Depression and the city's recommitment to no-nonsense white supremacy, having his valise, his Victrola, and his shoes stolen from him within 2 days of his arrival. Even in the Bohemian enclave of Greenwich Village, both Baldwin and Delaney faced the most severe forms of housing and employment discrimination and learned to not turn their heads, yet still prepared to run when someone yelled nigger or faggot, especially if that someone was a police officer. Both men, the mature artist and the apprentice, were attempting to achieve the nearly impossible. They sought meaning and beauty in a world that is in very large part senseless and ugly. I fret about these matters. I stutter and fuss because I'm vibrantly and distressingly aware of the ways in which we continually turn images of African American suffering into remarkable art. the staccato pacing of singers afraid of the whip or desperate to earn $1 or $5 or $10 so that they might survive the night is a fundamental, perhaps the fundamental underpinning of what we euphemistically term American culture. What is equally important to consider, however, are the many ways that Buford helped young James to not only understand these ugly realities and complex processes, but also how to live with and within them. What I want to do then is radically expand our understanding of James's apprenticeship to Buford. The lessons that the older artist offered his younger protege were not simply or even primarily aesthetic, but also social. Buford showed James what it meant to be a celebrated Black artist. He taught the boy, taught him with the example of his own life, that though he might be widely seen and even heralded, he nonetheless could never be in complete control of the procedures of salutation and commemoration that dictate who is in or out, highly rewarded, or left to starve in cold water flats. In the process, Buford separated the concepts of celebrity and celebration from any easy connection to images of glamour, wealth, notoriety, or even fun. The sluggishness of this chapter, the waste of time as I've made up my mind about what truly passed between the gifted youth and his mentor, has to do with the fact that I'm increasingly suspicious of the standard narrative of their relationship. Even Baldwin's own claim that Buford was the first walking, living proof for me that a Black man could be an artist seems chafing and inexact, especially given Baldwin's ongoing association with the poet County Cullen, his attendance at the marvelous spectacle of Orson Welles' 1936 production of Voodoo Macbeth, and more important still, his upbringing in Harlem, where even during the Depression, a quick-witted boy might easily spy some of the greatest stars of American popular culture entering the Cotton Club, the Savoy, or the Apollo, then laughing on the avenue before grabbing food and drink at a local pub. What I suggest then is that we expand a bit the idea that what Buford taught James was how to see, instead, within the always tricky and uncertain light of the Funhouse, both the cold, strange light in Buford's apartment and even colder, even stranger light surrounding the Black with the temerity to be noticed and noticed, noticed and noted. One must learn not only how to see, but also how to be seen. Though it is infrequently noted, it was Buford Delaney who initiated the decades-long tradition of imaging James Baldwin, the same imaging that allows current generations to fawn over the many photographs, interviews, and documentaries that were produced in the wake of the maestro's many passings. Delaney's 1941 portrait of Baldwin, Dark Rapture, was, I believe, the first professionally produced image of the writer. Like Delaney's later portrait of Canada Lee, the work has been painstakingly composed. An erect Baldwin sits at the work's center, his youthful torso demonstrating a sort of geometric perfection, while as in Campfire in the Park, the borders of composition are carefully demarcated, two trees framing Baldwin's form and acting as witnesses to the grandeur that Delaney clearly meant to evoke. Again, we see Delaney's absolute fascination with light and tone, as the covering of the lounge on which Baldwin sits reveals every color in the spectrum, while the nonchalant bursts of yellow next to and above his head suggest halos and indeed rapture. At the same time, the conceit of the picture, its majesty, is how Buford's painterly control exists so easily beside both excess and opacity. The intensely drawn angularity of the model's body is wrong. The lack of strict distinction between surfaces, bed, boy, couch, tree, sky, floor, is wrong. More telling still, the modeling of the model's skin, the imprecision, or is it over-precision, of the artist's palette suggests a thing that is falling apart. Baldwin appears as so much cooked meat made more delectable in the process. And lest his viewers ignore or forget the seriousness of the experiments that Delaney is attempting, he resolves the painting with one bit of certainty, that spot of dark, black, blue-green color between the boy's thighs, representing the possibility, the story, if you will, of genitalia. or to refer once again to Delaney's portrait of Canada Lee, where the older and established Lee works to corral the light of celebrity and notoriety, the rainbow. Here we see that Baldwin has been consumed by that light. There is no easy distinction between the boy and the spectra of luminosity and hue within which we view the boy. When I experienced this remarkable painting up close, I was taken up for a moment with a crushing desire to touch it. Good sized at 34 by 28 inches, it fantastically demonstrates Delaney's preference for thickly applied impasto style painting that draws attention to both the hand of the painter and the depth and the three-dimensionality of the painter's subject. The effect is one of immediacy and promise. The canvas seems wet and just finished, as if painter and model have just exited the scene, escaping the lost summer heat for a quick drink and a smoke. Dark Rapture is fully present and available for its viewers. Even with all of its sophistication on ready display, there's nothing aloof about the work. Instead, light, color, and the erect figure of the boy all bespeak unlimited promise, the very promise that Delaney clearly saw in Baldwin when his youthful friend first crossed the threshold at 181 Green. What startles, however, is both how little and how much the work reveals about either the maestro or his pupil. Dark Rapture was one of the very few nude portraits ever produced by an ever reticent and formal Buford Delaney. Further, the fact that the work is a representation of a 17-year-old who was most likely still an active Pentecostal minister when he first sat for the artist is a matter that gives one pause. Or to state the matter differently, I do not worry about what might have happened between Buford and James as the youth sat disrobed in Delaney's apartment, because though I'm deeply impressed by the painting, I find very little that specifically reminds me of James Baldwin in it. Though Dark Rapture is ostensibly a figurative, its unremitting focus on style and technique tilted decidedly toward the abstraction that increasingly captured Buford's attention. I must say then, and with no small amount of embarrassment and hesitation, that what Buford captured here was not so much James as the very complex protocols of visuality in and by which James was seen. Like an ever-ready pimp looking for new product and possibility on a Harlem Avenue, Buford asks, "Whose little boy are you?" The problem, however, is that the answer is wholly equivocal. James Baldwin is the property of the church, the school, and the street. He carried the gift of his stepfather's name and the scent of his biological father's ruin with equal measures of elegance and gaucherie. In Harlem, he was a precious little Negro who needed protection. In Greenwich Village, he was a black buck against whom a white community might rightly and regularly turn their guns. The genius of Delaney is that he was able to capture all that contradiction and make something beautiful of it. In Dark Rapture, Delaney attempted to demonstrate the complication and perhaps even the beauty of James' pitch struggle with the many images of James. He understood, moreover, that there was something majestic in that struggle. I'm not at all certain, however, that James felt the same. Thank you so much, everyone. And back to you, Claudia.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Thank you for the fascinating presentation, truly. We already have a few questions. So the first one is, one of the aspects that impressed me was how your readings, interpretations, and analysis move across distinct media and contexts so effortlessly. Art objects, literature, historical processes, individual biographies, streetscapes. How do you maintain a consistent voice across these distinct genres of experience? Sorry.
The funny thing about it is that it's I don't know what the opposite of effortlessly is, but there's just lots of effort to make that happen. And I think that that's a writerly question, really. And so The way to do that is, in fact, one of the things that writers need to do always, if you're going to be good, is to put lots of work into what it is that you are doing, and to then put even more work into and to hide that fact for your audience. I'll say this, that one of the things that Buford Delaney helps me to do is to deal with the fact that James Baldwin also worked across genre. And one of the reasons that we're so interested in James Baldwin has to do with the fact that he was so imaged. There's so many images of him. And I'm very intimidated in the project about how to deal with those many images. And so with Delaney, it gave me the opportunity to see a process by which that imaging begins. And so part of the reason that I can get through it, and I think that I hope that my readers will be able to get through it, is that I build the way that our images of I build the story of how James Baldwin was imaged alongside the story of how James Baldwin thought about images and produced them.
Great. The next question is, this was a thrilling read. To invite you to think through Beowulf Delaney Painterly's method as a theory of narrative. Drawing on your trick description of dark rapture, I wanted to hear if you had thoughts about writing in a painterly way, a way I hear in your approach to the especially fraught task of capturing artistic intimacy.
Okay, so clearly, Claudia, you have front-loaded the difficult questions right up front, and so thanks. The truth of the matter is that I am a person who thinks, it's interesting, I'll say the truth of the matter. I don't think at all about, I think as a writer, first and foremost, and I don't think so much about visual culture, but I consume visual culture in a greedy fashion. I love fine art, and I love bad art, and I love the way that we put together, we design the world. And so one of the things for me with Delaney is to think about the fact that Delaney began as a person who began doing portraits, and I mean pretty traditional portraits. And once you look at the movement of Delaney, including, by the way, Delaney did probably 12 or 14 portraits of James Baldwin. Even in those portraits, the figuration, the human form starts to vanish, and you get into more and more abstract ways of thinking, and more abstract considerations of the way that Latin color actually work. So that by the end of his life, he was painting mainly in yellow, and in works in some works that had no human figures in it at all. We tend to, in the art history that I've read on Delaney, you tend to think, oh, here's the period in which he only thought about painting portraits, and then here's the period in which he only thought about abstraction. Not all of it does that, but a lot of it in fact does. But the truth of the matter is, I think that even when you are looking at those portraits, you see Delaney really concerned with not so much representing what he believed to be the the reality of that person's form, but representing the way in which that person existed within light. And I press that forward to think he's trying to represent not so much what the person's physical body was like, but what the person's social body was like, if you can understand what I mean, how that person actually existed in the society and the many ways in which people are seen. And once you see that in Delaney, and once you recognize it, something that he's not hiding, he's very clear about it. Once you get that, you see, oh my gosh, this man really was a genius. This guy is really trying to demonstrate that we're looking at each other all the time as if we're landscape, and that we're much less focused on individual faces, individual subjectivity than we claim to be.
Mm-hmm. Great. Next one. Can you give us a preview of how you're addressing the subject of Baldwin's celebrity? What led you to Baldwin as a celebrity versus primarily a writer?
There are two answers to that. One is that, I've been in the sort of cottage industry of James Baldwin literally my entire professional career. And one of the things that people said for many years until the release of the James Baldwin papers at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in 2016, 2017, was that, oh my gosh, we cannot know the real James Baldwin because we don't have his archives and we don't have his papers. And so when I decided I wanted to start doing this work, that was in 2016, those archives had not opened. So I began by just looking at the materials that were available to us with James Baldwin, and there it was an avalanche of materials available on James Baldwin. There are so many interviews, there's so many images, there's so many considerations of him, there's so much literary and cultural criticism, and there are at least 10 other biographies. So I began to wonder, what is it that we think that we don't know about this man? And why is it that with all of this information, we imagine that there's still a real Jimmy who is beneath all of the information and all the work that has in fact been done on him. So that sparked something in me that was really moving and challenging to me. Mm-hmm. Second, I'll say about it that we have now retaken up James Baldwin as a real hero for people who think of themselves as progressive people, left people. And I think we forget the fact that James Baldwin, though he was celebrated during his own time, there was an incredible amount of hostility to him that happened cheek by jowl, often by the same person. And so I wanted us to understand why it is that what that procedure is. And then the last thing I'll say is that we are a country that is going through a very, very difficult time. I mean, people in the US now. And we have to, at some point, come to grips with the fact that our current president was largely elected on the strength of his being a successful reality television star. We're fascinated by celebrity in this country. And it often really eclipses everything else, though I think that for people who study American culture, we tend to be aloof from celebrity and aloof from popular culture. And I thought, okay, this is something I could do and make a real contribution with, versus doing another study of his literature primarily, which I adore, or trying to tell you what the true story of his romantic life is, or a variety of things that I think other people might be able to do better.
Mm. Yeah, I guess following up on what you just said, a question is, the lack of scandal in your presentation of Delaney's nude portrait of Baldwin is refreshing. What do you think? What do you think is the value of showing us how artists learn what their image means to others, which you're addressing here and also brought up in the chapter of Baldwin in Once You Go Black?
Oh wow! There's the person who actually read that book. Well, I'll say anybody who knows me well, could say to you, I'm a pretty mischievous person. So if there was scandal, I would have told you. And I think people are often looking for a scandal with James Baldwin. People regularly come up to me and I tell them I'm writing something like a biography of James Baldwin, and they always ask me questions about his sex and romantic life, which is interesting, but not nearly as interesting as I think people would like it to be. I think with Baldwin, I can't do the relationship between our earlier work that I've done in Baldwin and what I've done now. What I can say is that I think that as a creative person myself, I think that the most intimate thing that I do with other people is write. And I think that writers think that are trying very hard to connect, and that this formal process, these words on the page, is the most difficult and human thing that we do. While other people think, oh, if you can just get past those words, you'll get to what the infinite person is. I know that with Buford Delaney, that his most intimate ways to express and connect with other human beings was through his use of the paintbrush and the canvas. And so I'm not so concerned with scandal there. I am concerned with intimacy and the ways in which he is trying to have a conversation in Dark Rapture and the dozen other paintings that he did with James Baldwin. He's trying to have a conversation with James Baldwin about James Baldwin. And so I'm trying to not get into that head of saying, oh, let me tell you what he's really trying to say. I'm trying to actually listen to that conversation and to take it seriously and to believe that what creative people, what artists do is try to communicate as best we know how, and to not believe that that our forms are things that get in the way, but our forms are in fact our voices. Mm-hmm. I wish I had a better, more eloquent answer than that.
That's plenty good. To what do you attribute James Baldwin's resilience? While he spent time abroad, he seemed keenly aware of racial reality, and some account make a lot of his time outside of the US. Is this too simplistic an explanation?
Uh, I now am working actually on the section chapter that I'm calling Ingenue about James Baldwin's 10 years in Paris. And it's interesting to me that one of the things about James Baldwin that he liked very much about going to Paris, and that he says regularly, but I think people miss, is that he liked the quiet of it. James Baldwin was not a French-speaking person for the first 2 years that he was in Paris. That's a wild thing to understand. And so part of what he liked was that he was in Paris and unable to hear what other people were saying, and that allowed him to go through a process of being able to hear his own voice and being able to figure out what his own ideas are. I will tell you, interestingly, my own French teacher made me listen to subsequent James Baldwin interviews. And the first interviews, James Baldwin's French was not that much better than my French. My French is not good. I understand that process of going to another place just so that you can, in fact, be left alone and deal with the silence. I don't know that I know to be true. This is what I think is also true because I understand it as a person myself. It is not the case that James Baldwin was not hurt by the things that he saw happening or that happened to him. It is the case, however, that he was very aware of that hurt. And so I think that part of the resilience is that he talked about it, he wrote about it with his friends, he had a community of people that he was a pain in the butt with, and that he was tender with, and he had people who would literally break down the door and say, you're going out drinking with us now. And so his resilience is not distinct from other people's resilience. It basically was being part of a community of people who didn't get it mainly and who were also themselves rather complicated, but who were around. And that he was also part of that community. And he really did understand him as part of himself as part of the movement. The movement, however, also sucked a lot of energy out of him, and people could be unbelievably hostile to
him. Next question. Would you share any surprises you've experienced in your engagement with James Baldwin archives at the Schomburg Center?
There are a billion surprises. I'll give you one that is so good that I really should not give it to you. But again, I'm mischievous and a big mouth, so I'll just do it anyway. And that is that one of the letters to James Baldwin that just knocked me out of my socks. Is that how it happened? I had bad phrases. I knocked my socks off or something. Was a letter from the assistant to Jim Jones, the former pastor of the People's Temple. And if you remember the People's Temple in 1978, I believe 918 people, members of the People's Temple, committed mass suicide in Guyana. Before they left for Guyana, they wrote to James Baldwin to say, we love your work, and we love all the impressive stuff that you're doing around interracialism, and we love the work that you're doing about sexual liberation, and thank you so much. And all of our children are reading, have just seen a film that was done in San Francisco about James Baldwin, and we're encouraging everyone to read your works. And Minister Jones quotes regularly from you, and so he asked me to write this letter to you to let you know that how appreciative you are. 2 years later, all of those people were dead. And so I know it was wild to me to see that he kept that letter and that it came to me, to us 30, 40 years later. And also it's wild to me it was an affecting moment for me. I was in the library and full of emotion about it, because it was an affecting moment when you realize, gosh, he had to have known that these people who ended up committing the largest act of mass suicide perhaps ever known in our species, have in fact focused on him very, very strongly and believed that he was very, very supportive of their actions, some of which he would have been supportive of, but also supportive ultimately of actions that were as anti-human as you could possibly be. So it made me think, it made me be even more sober about what it takes to be that type of public figure and what type of responsibility is put on you, especially if you're not cynical, and especially if you're a person who really does care about the rest of the population.
Your comments about the culture of celebrity make me think of the relationship between James Baldwin and Gore Vidal.
Mm.
Do you have any thoughts about the difference between the public reception of Baldwin and Vidal?
I don't. I wish I could answer that question. I have read, I have not seen, I've seen the two of them talk a little bit about each other, but I just don't know much about their relationship. I'm so sorry. There are other people that I know better that there's more evidence within the actual paper that is left to us of the several archives. But with Gore Vidal, I don't know that question. I'm actually, it's so funny. I'm been for some years now afraid that someone would ask me this question because I wish that I had an answer. I just don't.
Next question. It occurs to me that part of our enduring fascination with Baldwin is the ability to marry one or more Baldwin's images as a writer, as a man, and now LGBTQ icon, with his ideas, essays, and fiction. I think this is something we all do. We select the image of Baldwin's that best complements our estimation of him. I suspect this is true even for those who dislike Baldwin. Can you comment on this?
Well, my comment is my work here is done. You know that this is exactly the thing that I would like to do. Is to demonstrate that in fact we're all interested first and foremost, and we think that each of us has the true James Baldwin, but all of us are dealing in fact with well-prepared images of James Baldwin, including Buford Laney trying to teach James Baldwin that the people are going to prepare images of you, and you might as well get used to that, and you're going to have to deal with those images. I'll say this, that one of the things that's daunting to me about trying to write a biography about James Baldwin is James Baldwin has a fair amount to say about biography. And he says in a nasty review of Shirley Graham's biography of Frederick Douglass, James Baldwin was a mean reviewer. He says in this really unpleasant review of this, I think, book from 1947, that there is no way that you could know the psychology of a person from their papers, and that what you ought to focus on is, in fact, the sort of, in fact, the secondary materials. I've decided to do that, and I'm not even making an argument for that being the right thing to do. It also happens to be the thing that I feel most comfortable doing versus trying to replicate what the real James was like. I'll say in relation to this, I've been having an ongoing argument with friends of mine, which they think that they're winning, but I'm in fact fully winning. And that argument is that I refuse to, I'm very sparing about referring to James Baldwin as Jimmy, in that I don't want to get into that head of feeling like, one, I can either ventriloquize Baldwin, or that I actually am getting up close to this sort of diminutive and young person, or this fun person, in a way that this paper is allowing me to do that. I do refer to James Baldwin as Jimmy when, in fact, the archives are referring to him as Jimmy. Otherwise, I refer to him as James or James Baldwin.
Wonderful. Thank you, Robert. Thank you for the fascinating presentation and perspective on Baldwin. I also want to thank you, our audience, for the terrific questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. And with that, I thank you all today and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.